Are we ready, Florine? Yes, okay, perfect. So welcome everyone. Welcome to our Doing Gender lecture series at Utrecht University in the Graduate Gender Studies program. I'm Magdalena Górska and I will be chairing this session. The session is usually, this season of the Doing Gender lectures is organized by Jamila Maskat, but I am chairing the session of today, which is a session with Ewa Majewska. I will try to take as little time as possible because I think we have so much to talk about and so much to learn from Ewa. Just maybe a short introduction. Ewa is a feminist philosopher and an activist based in Poland. She taught at University of Warsaw and also at Jagiellonian University in Krakow. And she's also a scholar who has multiple affiliations across the world. So she was a scholar at ICI in Berlin, but also, for example, in California, at the University of California in Berkeley. Ewa is also a prolific writer and author. So she wrote four books in Polish, and now her first book in English, Feminist Antifascism, which I am very happy to have and read, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about. She also wrote over 50 articles in well-recognized journals. I'm not going to mention them, but if you follow Ewa's website on academia, you will find out more. So this is a brief introduction to Ewa. Maybe last thing is that right now she's lecturing at UDK in Berlin, and she is working on another book, as I was told, but I'm not going to tell more about it. That's still work in progress. And her talk today is going to focus on her book, the one I already mentioned, and on the issue of feminist anti-fascism. And specifically, what I'm really looking forward to hearing about in this lecture is Ewa's approach to politics, which are based on the notion of the weak resistance as a counter-hegemonic approach to the way how we understand political resistance and political organizing. So thank you, Ewa, so much for accepting our invitation. It's really a pleasure and an honor to have you here, and we are very much looking forward to your lecture.
Thank you so very much for inviting me to lecture, for this introduction, and for your attention and for being here. I must begin with a sort of solidarity shout to all those people in Ukraine or those fleeing Ukraine, because I think the war that Putin started against Ukraine is just neighboring. So we are joking in Poland now that we have a Polish-Ukrainian Republic because the amount of refugees that we are hosting currently surpassed 1 million persons, and more are coming, obviously, fleeing the bombings. So as most scholars are usually happy when their books seem to be accurate or adequate to the historical conditions. And with me, it's the opposite. I'm not very happy that a certain actuality of my book has been proven by the events of today. I basically think that it would be so much better if my book lost some of its perhaps actuality. So writing about feminist anti-fascism, obviously I try to build a sort of argumentation for a transition within the political studies and political theory, which consists in the changement of understanding of the relations of anti-fascism and feminism. So until recently, I believe that it was quite common within the fascism studies, political studies, etc., to locate anti-fascism and feminism separately. So we would have the political theory in the core of the interest and fascism within it to some extent. And then we would also have feminism as a kind of side element of the map of the political debates. I believe that since at least a couple of decades, but in the last decade especially, after the Black Lives Matter, the Me Too actions, and the International Women's Strike, we can very well say that today's anti-fascism has a feminist face. This is the way I prefer to. To phrase it. So basically, we have to rethink, I believe, our understanding of the relations between anti-fascism and feminism, and we have to be more capable to situate feminism at the core of today's anti-fascism. This, as I mentioned already, comes from within the anti-fascist movements today, but it also has been caused, I believe, by what my distinguished colleagues Agnieszka Graf and Elżbieta Korolczuk call the anti-gender movements. So the anti-gender movements that are active throughout the globe, they are active in Brazil, in the United States of America, in the Western and Eastern Europes, if we can distinguish them so much, in Putin's Russia, unfortunately, in all kinds of places. We have the emergence of radical right-wing fundamentalism, which self-describes as anti-gender. What it means to be anti-gender is not exactly clear to me. However, my colleagues whom I mentioned already define those movements as preoccupied with the politics of private life. So politics of sexuality, of gender, of reproduction and reproductive rights. They are obviously anti-abortion. They are very critical and against also the birth controls. They are homophobic to a large extent, or opposing the rights and visibility of non-heteronormative persons and couples and groups. So while some of the scholars who are investigating today's anti-gender movements avoid the word fascism and try to separate those formations, those fundamentalist right-wing formations, as a distinct phenomenon, I actually tend to see them as elements of today's fascism, or at least as having certain common threats, common characteristics, or certain elements of the classical fascist doctrine. If we look into, and this is very, I feel very awkward while starting a feminist lecture with a long discussion of fascism. But this is unfortunately the times that we are living. We have to be capable to look at this darker side, at this painful and ethically controversial, to say the least, part of our politics, because this is where we are, and this is also what feminism today, both as theory and as practice, has to stand up against. So so the anti-gender movement, most scholars are not seeing them as fascist. For me, they are having characteristics of fascism. And if we look down to the historical formations of fascism, especially in Nazi Germany, we can very easily discover that their interest was not only about the state and about the authoritarian organization of the state, as in Nazi Germany, but within the Nazi German social and cultural politics, it was equally important to provide a segregation, I would say, between genders, so to provide a clear distinction between what it means to be a woman and a man. There was obviously no third options whatsoever, and today in anti-gender movements, this is very clear as well, that they do not want any trans or non-binary people, just as much as they don't want any homosexual or otherwise non-heteronormative persons and groups. So therefore, the preoccupation of fascism, not only with political life, but also with privacy and with intimacy, has a historical dimension. So this is one of the reasons why I'm looking at today's fundamentalist and ultra right-wing movements from this perspective. But I promised, and Magda also announced my lecture as one that will be talking about feminism. So therefore, I'm going to leave fascism apart for a second. Perhaps I have to add one note, a kind of personal note. While I wrote this book, but also while I do all this feminist theory and practice every day, I have a sense of weak messianism. This is a notion created by Walter Benjamin, German Jewish philosopher from early 20th century, who spoke of weak messianism as a connection that is a necessary one among those who are oppressed and underprivileged to stay together across generations. So therefore there is a certain obligation and legacy that I also feel inclined to continue, which is one with those who have been oppressed and who have been victims of historical fascism. So the slogan "never again," as much as it proves not to be accurate, unfortunately, is also a sort of duty or obligation, a normative framework within which I move. And as a follower also of Donna Haraway's concept of situated knowledges, obviously I need to situate my knowledge or the theories that I'm creating in a specific context. And this context is basically somewhere between Warsaw and Berlin. So living in both of those cities forces to rethink not only the relations between Poland and Germany, but also the relations between various political doctrines. And from there, a sort of solid anti-fascism can be built. So this is where this kind of thinking came from. So then, I would like to offer you a brief recapitulation of what it meant to be a feminist in Poland and in Warsaw, especially since 2016, which is a moment when the feminist protests, so-called black protests, not because of the racialized perspective on the human bodies, but because of the clothes that women were wearing as a sign of protests. So, so this first wave, I would say, of the big mass feminist protests, it was 2016, and it was a moment when fundamentalist organizations, as well as the Polish government, started debating further limitation of the reproductive rights. So, in opposition to this proposal that women should be punished for trying to terminate pregnancies, a movement created itself basically overnight. So after the first annunciation that such law criminalizing women for making abortions, when this was announced in April 2016, immediately online groups of women, both feminist activists, but also women who were so astonished by this proposal that they decided to jump in the feminist movement, were created. So overnight we had 100,000 of members of various feminist groups. The groups were called Girls to Girls, so dziewuchy dziewuchom, and they started to make the first protests already in April. But the biggest wave of protests and the famous women's strike came in the fall 2016, when and this has, I would argue, this had two waves. So the first wave was actually a sort of online protest when women were invited by Gocha Adamczyk, a member of Razem, Social Democrat Party, to join with an online protest which consisted in uploading photographs, selfie kind of photographs, wearing black, with the slogan, I support the black protests, so I support the feminist protests. So this hashtag became the biggest event in the Polish internet, if we can sort of speak of national parts of internet. And it was extremely successful. It was 250,000 of photographs of women, of groups of women and girls, also sometimes also men or non-binary and trans persons who were supporting the women's rights in the context of reproduction. And this online protest was for many women, as my sociologist friends have proven later, it was a sort of in-between steps between not being politically active as a feminist or in any other way, and becoming a street protester, a feminist, a fierce feminist, an activist, etc., etc. So I'm looking at this moment of the online sharing of selfie photographs as a moment of what Boris Groys calls weak universalism. So he looks at the avant-gardes of early 20th century as movements which not only worked with sophistication and exceptionality of the artist figure, but also which, I would say, communalized the artistic production by means of choosing simple, abstract figures known to everybody in their societies. So if you look from this perspective, as Boris Groys suggests, at the, let's say, Russian avant-garde of the early 20th century, or if you look from this perspective at Joseph Beuys claiming that everyone is an artist, you will probably see my, or actually Boris Groys's point. It is by means of abstraction that paradoxically art became more available, accessible, more also inclusive for larger parts of the society. So my argument about the Black protests in Poland in 2016 is actually similar. It's based on similar assumption that offering to every woman and every person in Poland and across the borders as well, offering a way of becoming politically engaged and yet not even getting out of their homes, was a strategy to universalize political involvement in a much more effective way than, let's say, inviting people to the street demonstrations already. So this intermediate step had two elements that are important for my conceptualizing of weak resistance. One of them was that it was perfectly ordinary. Most people today use smartphones or cameras and social media on a daily basis. Therefore, it was quite easy for the majority of the population to actually get involved with an action that they comprehended, that they had some control over, because it was them who were choosing how they look on the photograph, what is on the photograph, etc., etc., and was sharing it online. So this happened in September 2016. And then after this, so one more thing about this online protest is that this commonality of this action of posting somebody's selfie picture online is actually an activity that made me think about the notion of the common, which I borrow from Antonio Negri and Michael Hart from their constant work together, but specifically from the Commonwealth's book published some years ago. So in that book, Negri and Hart, they explain the common as a third way. So we usually think of property as private or public, and they speak of the common as something that is shared together, like what we call the natural resources, or like culture, languages, the air we breathe, the resources, as I said, etc., etc. So being shared together, being operated by the multitude in action, is the first understanding of the common that I'm thinking of. But the second meaning of the word common was sort of offered to me by the mobilization of feminist movement in Poland in 2016, and it was that the actions that connect the participants of the common, the elements of the common, the subjects of the common, if you will, those activities very often are very common in a sense of being popular, simple, accessible, non-exceptionary, or non-heroic. So therefore, for me, this intermediate phase between the initial demonstrations of feminist movement in 2016 in April, then September, this online sort of gathering, and then 3rd of October, the moment of the International Women's Strike, where some hundreds of thousands of women in Poland and across the borders have gone to the street and resigned from working on that specific day. So therefore, we speak of women's strike. This was a moment of huge mobilization, and this was also a moment which I later called the moment when feminism ceased to be a sort of elitary movement of the metropolitan educated feminists and became a massive movement. So obviously for that I was very much criticized by fellow feminist academics and fellow feminist activists who, like myself, for 20 last years have been busy with doing feminist theory and practice. So for those people, it was sometimes very difficult to accept this declaration of the beginning of feminism, which I did. But still, nevertheless, we all agree here in Poland that this was a groundbreaking moment for feminism, not only in Poland, but also internationally, because as it was quickly discovered, also women in Italy, in South Korea, and in Mexico and Argentina were beginning their big protests, feminist protests, sometimes based on the same principles and on the same problems, like in South Korea, which unfortunately has a very similar reproductive rights and abortion legislation that we have in Poland. So therefore, South Korean feminists were exactly even repeating our slogans back in Seoul and other places in Korea, because they were fighting exactly for the same cause, while in Italy, in Argentina, and in Mexico, the first and most important reason for the protests in 2016 and 17 was domestic violence and more generally violence against women. But nevertheless, those differences in what exactly is the main challenge for feminism, we sort of united. So there were several meetings and gatherings, interviews, common publications, and collective actions that have been building up to what was later called, when the US-American feminists also joined the protests on a massive scale, right after the election of President Trump, in the big march to Washington in January 2017. The International Women's Strike at that time was a sort of evident thing, but it was actually building up throughout the second part of 2016 between the countries and the women in the countries that I enumerated before. So the important parts of the feminist struggles today are actually that they try to be extremely universal, not in a sense of demanding a certain unity among the subjects, but because it is a mobilization, I would say, respecting, but also based on and founded on differences and distinctions and diversity. But there are certain elements that build this sense of common and commonality, and some of them also consist in using simple gestures, available, accessible, comprehensible gestures that do not require a huge cultural capital or economic capital. So using the hats in the United States, you probably remember those pink hats with cat kind of ears on the top of your head. So this was the common sort of denominator or common signifier for feminists. In Poland, it was wearing the black clothes. In South America and Mexico, it was the green flags, obviously, also in Ireland, the green flags for the cause of abortion. So, and in many countries, those mobilizations were in different ways successful. So in Poland, the law restricting the right to abortion was rejected. Unfortunately, it has been reprocessed, and in 2020, unfortunately, we have lost some of our reproductive rights here. But throughout 2016, 17, and 18, and even 19, the feminist mobilization was probably the only one that was really resisting the conservative government. So therefore, it was kind of important also on the general map. But I believe that for today's feminism and for today's anti-fascism as well, the 2017 events that we all remember as the Me Too actions were important as well. So what happened? What specific characteristics could be given to the events of the 2017? For me, the gesture of Alyssa Milano and later of other feminists and women, and also non-binary persons and trans persons as well, the gesture of sharing on social media the violence, the harassment that women and trans and non-binary people have suffered from as women's harassment, was a gesture of great, I would say, great simplicity, but also great resonance. For large parts, especially of the masculine parts of the societies in the countries where Me Too has had some resonance, the Me Too denunciations, the Me Too exclamations, the Me Too sharing of sexual violence experienced by women was actually a moment of a great eye-opening. And while we've been talking, as feminists and we as feminist activists and theorists have been repeating for decades and for generations that the violence against women, the sexual harassment, the rape are experiences that the majority of women have had at least a small part in, still it wasn't persuasive enough. I believe that after 2017 and what the 2017 Me Too actions have changed was the comprehension from large parts of different societies that violence against women actually is a reality, unfortunately. But it was achieved, if I may speak of achievement here, by means of great simplicity, by means of great, I would say, availability by common and daily and ordinary strategies that do not necessarily have a lot of heroism in it. So therefore, after this second example of the non-heroic, weak strategies, we have enough material, I think, to go towards a sort of general understanding of what weak resistance might be about. So first of all, weak resistance is an effort to collect together all kinds of resistance and political agencies that were not or could not be recognized within the classical political philosophy, which understands political agency to a large degree still in the context of male socialization and male roles and masculinity understood as cultural phenomenon and cultural complex of behaviors and normative practices. So the weak resistance can be seen as a feminist response to the classical conservative definitions of political agency. The weak resistance is also a kind of follow-up after the events of 2016, 2017, so after the International Women's Strike and the Me Too. So it is a theoretical notion and theoretical paradigm that actually is being shaped with the social movements, and therefore it bears the threats of many feminist and Marxist theoretical developments. The weak resistance is also a following of the queer theorist Jack Halberstam's thinking of the queer art of failure. So therefore, when we think about weak resistance, we can also think of those actions that were not really successes. So we may think of the strategies that might seem as failures, or might even be failures, and yet they are not. So I believe that all those moments when a refusal of being heroic is announced can be characterized as weak. And to give you an example, I will again go to Polish experiences of the last decade. So after 2015, when the Polish conservative government took over, so the Kaczyński party that you might have heard of, and their coalition members, heroism became a sort of political doctrine, but also the only version of political agency that is acceptable. So therefore, the Polish men had to be patriots, brave, heroic defenders of the homeland, which, by the way, was not attacked by anyone except the Minister of Defense, but this is a different story. So we have a paradoxical situation of a country which is rather safe and yet develops a version of heroism that could be understandable in the wartime, but not really under the conditions of peace. So this kind of militarized, heroic, brave masculinity was really pushed forward, and you have seen it probably with the coverages of the marches in Warsaw on the Independence Day, when neo-Nazi groups were taking over the capital of Poland, which has already had been occupied by Nazi army in the 1930s and 40s during the Second World War. So we don't need a repetition of that anymore, and yet we had government inclined and supported right-wing marches in the recent years. But also a version of heroism was imposed by the conservative government on women. So this version of, I would say, feminine heroism that is imposed by the Polish government should be read as the obligation to give birth no matter what. So these are actual words of the Vice Prime Minister of Poland, Jarosław Kaczyński, who said in 2017, I quote, "Women should give birth to children no matter what." And then, end of quote, and then to explain to you, no matter what means no matter what happens with the fetus. So whether the fetus is alive or not, whether the fetus has incurable diseases or not, still the woman should give birth. So this cruel statement became one of the kind of proverbial expressions of the heroism for women that the Polish government is enforcing on women here. And therefore, The weak resistance is also a refusal in any version of complying with this heroic political agency that has been provided for good citizens or good political subjects. But it also follows, as I mentioned, the Jack Halberstam's Queer Art of Failure, also in this context of being queer, of not being heteronormative, of not being heterosexual for that matter, or not belonging to any binary genders of masculinity or femininity. So therefore, the weak resistance can be seen also as a sort of umbrella term for queer, non-conforming, non-heroic forms of activity. Another reference for weak resistance, I have plenty of them and they are all very interesting, I hope. So another reference for them is the essay of Václav Havel, a Czech theater writer and later also the first president of the Czech Republic after 1989. So Václav Havel, in his essay written in 1978, speaks of the power of the powerless. So this is also a kind of political option that I'm very fond of, also because it is one created within the Central European, not only scholarship, but also activism. And therefore, it sort of expresses a certain moment of history and a certain lived experience that is quite precious. In our countries, which are quite small and usually situated somewhere between Russia and Germany, who are huge neighbors and sometimes a little bit pushy, we sort of create every now and then those versions of literature, of philosophy, of cultural practice, which speaks from the perspective of minority, from the perspective of a weak subject. So Václav Havel's claim of about the power of the powerless has some aspects of this, has some aspects of this position of a frightened minority sitting between two clashing empires. In this case, it was the USSR and the Soviet bloc versus obviously the Western world sort of led by the United States of America. So the sense of impossibility of any movement within this constellation, as Havel argued, gave the impression of the impossibility of any resistance and the futility of any resistance. While for Havel, as a person of theater also, I think, an interesting prospect was created precisely by the possibility of embracing this smallness, this weakness, this fear that individuals and groups were facing in Czechoslovakia of 1970s, and expressing resistance and expressing disagreement with minor small gestures. And I believe this kind of small and rather simple gesture has been recently done by the Russian journalist on yesterday's news, when she was showing the explanation in Russia that that the war in Ukraine has to stop, that the Russian media are spreading propaganda. So it was a moment when an ordinary person and a terrified person, I believe most people in Russia are terrified, as they face up to 15 years of imprisonment for saying anything that the authorities might consider untrue. So this is the almost exact definition of what they cannot do now in Russia. And yet this quite brave woman took a piece of Bristol with the explanation of how propaganda and lies are spread by the public media in Russia, and has shown it on the news. So right now she is accused, she was sentenced for a fine, but there are speculations also about her getting imprisoned, which is very unfortunate, and after which we should probably all sort of try to build a solidarity network to support her and other brave people protesting also in Russia against the war in Ukraine. I give you this example not only to speak of the bravery of this amazing TV producer, actually, who protested on the media yesterday, but also I try to shift towards a solidarity of the weak, which is an important aspect of the feminist anti-fascism and of the vision of collective agency that I'm trying to produce. So I believe that in the moment of weakness, in the moment with this sense of incompleteness and possible failure that individuals might have, this moment of weakness creates a sort of larger need for solidarity and collective action and sharing and being together than situations when we are all brave, safe, and not terrified at all. I think that those moments of weakening of the social and political status, of the safety measures, etc., they create paradoxically a necessity for getting together. This is not exactly my idea. It has been studied by social psychologists, obviously, but it also exists in the legacy and works of Immanuel Kant, who gives it a very nice formula of unsocial sociability. So he speaks of individuals forming groups with others with whom they often do not share the aims, and also with others whose aims even contradict the aims of us. And yet we form social constructions, societies, civilizations, cities, groups, collectives, etc., because we know that on our own we will not accomplish anything. So this is, I believe, another sense and another layer of the feminist anti-fascism. It's that in the recognition of our being weak, so of us being, let's say, considered a minority, of having the experiences of different kinds of oppression and of discrimination, in those moments, I believe that this sense of necessity for building collective actions is actually quite strong. And so when I mentioned in the beginning the feminist phase of today's anti-fascism, I'm also speaking about that. I'm also speaking of anti-fascism, which is different from the anti-fascism that we might have in our memories or in our knowledge or even experience, because it is an anti-fascism of the weak. So in the recent, a couple of months ago, I participated in a debate over a new book about fascism, which was written by the British anti-fascist thinker and journalist Paul Mason. And his vision of anti-fascism was particularly heroic and brave. So at a certain point, I even made this slightly naughty observation that as a woman from northern Western country, I might not feel strong or male enough to actually enter this anti-fascism. So we had a whole debate about to what extent anti-fascism consists in repeating the heroic scenario and the heroic attitudes of those who build fascism, or to what extent and how to what extent the anti-fascist movement and anti-fascist theory should, to quote Audre Lorde, not borrow the tools of the master in order to dismantle his house, right? So the feminist anti-fascism is a politics based on those less spectacular forms of agency, the persistence, resilience, the ability to survive and maintain life functions, very neglected in history manuals. If you look at any historical books, you will only see battles, colonizations, and occupations, but you will not very much see the weapons of the weak, which is, by the way, a title of another reference that I'm using very often, the book by James Scott, The Weapons of the Weak, where he follows the protests of peasants in Far East Asia in order to conclude that strategies of protest that do not proceed with heroic means, which sometimes even work without any particular slogan, can be more effective than noisy, articulate protests that he had seen elsewhere. So his argument about the peasants and their peaceful, quiet and very simple strategy of simply walking in protest became a sort of highlight of the anthropology of protests and political anthropology, to an extent that it became an inspiration to many decolonial and post-colonial theories, as well as for the weak resistance that I'm building in the book and elsewhere. The interesting thing is that within today's fascism, the calls to glorify, I would say, the heroic masculinity are connected, are combined with the calls for women to be occupying traditional roles. And therefore, the preoccupation with sexual agency, with reproduction, is an element which used to be important for classical fascism, yet I believe today became even more central, if one can say that. Also, the spectacular homophobia of the Nazi Germany. We must remember that the concentration camps were also, unfortunately, places of death of the homosexual men, especially. So the homophobia of classical fascism survives today, but it is being supplied by transphobia, by biphobia, by all kinds of phobias against those who do not comply with binary gender roles and or heteronormativity. So therefore, today's anti-fascism, I would say, is also, it's not only a practice of frightened common people, which is a very controversial thing to say, but I hope to wake a discussion by saying precisely this sentence. But it is also a sense of diversity and heterogeneity of the embodied experiences of identity, of sexuality, of intimacy. So therefore, I would suggest that the feminist anti-fascism is actually not only a defense of women's rights, but also a sort of heterogeneity, postulative, strategic heterogeneity of genders and identity and sexuality orientations and positions that one can occupy. When I was mentioning, and this is going to be probably my last sort of theme within this lecture, when I was mentioning the unfortunate accuracy and actuality of my book in today's context of the war against Ukraine, I didn't mention to what extent Vladimir Putin and Russia's recent years' politics has been shaped as containing at least fascist elements, to put it mildly. So since the wars in Chechnya, obviously racism and anti-Caucasian Caucasus nations sort of were the oppressed minority. But since 2010, different regions in Russia started to legally ban what they called homosexual propaganda or homosexual ideology. It was so popular in different regions of Russia that in 2012, a law has passed in Duma, so the Russian parliament, that the LGBT ideology is banned from education, from public discourse, and from public media, from media at all, basically. This actually means delegalization of non-heterosexuality. So this has happened in Russia, together with something that most people have not noticed or have not heard about, but for me it was particularly important. The Russian parliament erased from the penal code the paragraph criminalizing violence against women, domestic violence against women. So therefore, to put it very strictly and very strongly, domestic violence ceased to be a crime in Russia. I must say that those elements of contemporary Russian politics, very much supported by Vladimir Putin, together with further discrimination of non-heterosexual groups and persons, of women, etc., builds up to create of Putin not only somebody who has some imperialist imagination or imperialist desires, but also positions those imperialist desires in a context of classically fascist mindset. So therefore, it has been the same with the Polish government, actually, which on one hand was sort of pumping the militarized heroism onto the Polish men, on the other hand was pushing Polish women towards the enforced heroism by restricting access to abortion and contraceptives. But also in Poland, we've had a similar tendency to what happened earlier in Russia. So various regions in Poland started to vote for delegalization of the LGBT ideology to an extent that at a certain point, 35% of the Polish territory became homophobic. So became covered with those homophobic zones. Luckily for us, we belong to the European Union still, and therefore the European institutions demanded the withdrawal of those de facto illegal acts of homophobia in regions. So right now, the amount of the municipalities and regions that have homophobic laws has decreased quite strongly. However, still some parts of Poland have this kind of semi-legal documents excluding what was called LGBT ideology, or supporting traditional values, but in ways that exclude people of non-heteronormative intimacy life or identity from those regions. To conclude, I would like to say that for me, the relative success of the feminist movements in the last year has been granted by the fact that the majority of feminist mobilizations were not only organized as street protests or internet protests or media protest or social media protest, but they were functioning as an alternative public sphere for those oppressed and excluded, in this case for women. Therefore, the Counterpublics, which is a notion that I borrow from Nancy Fraser, who speaks about US-American feminist movements as feminist counterpublics since the 1990s, this notion has provided a wonderful context for the understanding of what feminism became today. So it is a critique of some of the existing governments in the countries where the governments are openly conservative and push women to the traditional roles. The criticism of those specific legislative and cultural procedures is a core element, but also, I believe, feminism today functions as a counterpublics because it challenges the general social and cultural divisions. For instance, the divisions between the privileged, educated, and non-privileged, or undereducated persons who might want to share feminist political position and yet never sort of had a chance to find themselves in the same movement. So feminism functioning as a counterpublics has a twofold critical agency. One of them opposes specific legal and governmental proceedings, but another one is directed against the more general rules organizing the society from the point of view of the division of social and cultural capital, from the perspective also of racialized rules organizing the society, from the perspective of more kind of archetypical elements, I would say more general elements of society and culture than just the specific government. Feminism functions as a counterpublics also in such way that it is a transversal movement. So therefore it has elements of very different nature, beginning with even government members and prominent politicians who, as Octavia Cortez, for instance, in the US, or as Agnieszka Dziemianowicz-Bąk in Poland. So there are women politicians and queer politicians as well who claim to be feminists and who are occupying important roles in governments, parliaments, etc. But also anti-authoritarian and anti-government movements are parts of today's feminism. There are also NGO belonging feminists and cultural practitioners, feminists, and there are people doing feminism in all kinds of society clusters, sometimes with contradicting ontology, contradicting means and tools, and yet they are all claiming, or we are all claiming, to be part of feminism. Therefore, not only the heterogeneity of today's feminisms and feminists, but also the contradictory nature, the hybridity of today's feminism is important and constitutes an element of the counterpublic sphere, as I would say. The other aspect of the feminist anti-fascism is that it is not just inclusive, I would say, but it is learning from and moving across social strata which would not be considered an activist field, and yet where certain important transformations and feminist gains are accomplished. So I would speak here of private workplaces, of state institutions such as medical sector institutions, and which become not only, they have been feminized to a large extent, but now they are becoming feminist in their claims for workers' rights, for women, and with recognition to gender. I would speak of private businesses to a large extent becoming also at least conscious of the women's rights in their own ways. So therefore, the heterogeneity of the feminist mobilization is also a part of an anti-fascism, in the sense that the fascist preoccupation with homogeneity, with cleanness, with clarity of divisions is abandoned on the level of structure and also on the level of postulates and demands. I hope that this was a comprehensive, perhaps a bit chaotic, but comprehensive discussion of what feminist anti-fascism can be today. I will be very happy to hear your comments and questions, and also I would like to thank you very much for bearing with us for such a long time. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ewa. Thank you for this great talk and for bringing all those different examples, which I think are extremely important and contemporary. I, of course, prepared some questions, but I would like to open the floor first to our audience, also to our students who are part of this lecture today. So I would like to ask if anybody has any questions which you would like to share now. It's always a little bit difficult to start a discussion. So maybe I can start, but our students, please don't hesitate to ask questions also of clarification. Think of something which maybe you would like to know more about, or something which was not completely, or you would like it to be more elaborated and so on, while I will ask my first question and then we can see how we proceed. So Ewa, for me, what I really like about your work is this focus on the weak resistance, and the focus on the way how this weak resistance can create alternative forms of political action and alternative forms of understanding politics, right? And what you were talking about today is this. You are also stressing this aspect of the transversality, of the hybridity, of the multiplicity within your understanding of feminist anti-fascism. And one thing which I was kind of thinking around is that you at the same time still keep the notion of universality, right? You talk about the universality of the weakness, and I personally always struggle with the notion of universality, because it is such a problematic concept in terms of the heritage of how universality works, in order to homogenize, to also reproduce specific forms of privilegization of certain human subjects as human while others not, and so on. And the notion of universality of the human in general has been criticized from the decolonial, post-colonial, but also post-humanist perspectives. So I wonder what is your commitment to the notion of universality, and how does it sit with this transversality and hybridity you are talking about?
Thank you for this amazing question and comment. I believe that I share a large part of the fears and criticisms that that you have towards the notion of universality, especially from the perspective of, in various ways, minoritarian persons and groups that each of us has had throughout our lifetime. So there is an evident and obvious, I would say, legitimate fear of universality that I also have. So my attitude towards universality is exactly the same as Judith Butler's attitude towards the soul. She has this small text where she speaks about gender insubordination. It's a beautiful article from the 90s, I believe. I translated it into Polish sometime. So she speaks about, you know, gender unconformity or disobedience. And then suddenly she has this thought, which is totally on the margin, which is more or less like, we should actually produce a queer theory of the soul. Why leaving it to Aristotle and the likes? Something like this. And I love this statement. So basically my approach towards universality is based on similar audacity, I would say, and similar sense of collective sharing of this fantastic common, which is human knowledge. Some people long time ago created the notion of universality to protect all humans from all kinds of discriminations. It was in the antiquity, basically, when in different countries, but for example, in Greece, some people like Plato and Socrates were claiming, I would take Socrates actually, because I like, you know, the gay tradition of the European philosophy. It has to be said openly that we have, you know, queer roots with our, so for me, universality is something very specific because it has been invented by somebody who was moving between hetero and homo normativities, who was moving between the very, very powerful agents of his world, meaning, you know, the rulers of Greece, of Athens, but also who was building the notion of rationality as a shared asset, distinguishing the humans from the non-humans, which is today obviously to be negotiated or contested, but who was a person who would pick an illiterate, enslaved person to establish a conversation within which the person would prove their complete ability to understand mathematics, for instance. Today we might think that mathematics and the knowledge of mathematics is perhaps not something that we would fight for, although I would, but you know, so already here, and so my claim to universality is a claim to equal access to all the cultural and economic and other goods that humanity created. Basically, my understanding of universality is one that has been shaped by queer experiences of anti-slavery, early anti-slavery, so basically the one from Athens. So anti-slavery kind of attitudes and politics, which makes the possibility of a repetition of fascism, of slavery, of all those atrocious forms of servitude and dehumanization impossible. So for me, universality is an asset that we should redefine and use again in ways that acknowledge situatedness, that acknowledge diversity and difference, and that also build up a set of common rules and legislatives, making it impossible to deprive anyone from basically anything. So this is the universality I'm asking for. So it is not a universality that is only written in English. It is not a universality which is only for those who were born in certain areas of the world. This is not a universality that excludes people of a certain sexual agency. No, that's not the universal. So basically, I think that what we, and actually I think you would agree with me that all those objections to universality are based on critics of universality for excluding somebody. So basically, we criticize universality for its unreadiness to actually accomplish its premises, right? So that's the problem of universality. It is not that it wants everyone to be equal. I think this is not problematic for you, for me, for any decolonial thinker. What is problematic, however, is the demand for homogenization and exclusivity of all kinds. So this is what we have problem with, and this is something I believe very strongly to be fixed. But my preoccupation with universality comes from a sudden realization that after the neoliberal transition, after '89 and the killing of communism, although we should discuss to what extent communism has ever been practiced anywhere in the world until now, but after the death of communism and after the painful death of communism, let's put it this way, and the neoliberal transition, we have suddenly become societies that in many ways came back not only to the 19th century, but also to deep feudalism, in a sense that slavery has never been bigger than today, in a sense that militarization and exclusion have been proceeded globally in ways that have not been seen, but also in ways that different rights, so the labor rights, the women's rights, become, in many countries, become a big problem, we can observe a scarcity of those rights rather than their expansion. For instance, the labor rights, to be honest, today's, we know it from academia, right? The enforcement of norms of productivity that are impossible to accomplish. None of us can ever publish everything that we would like to publish. None of us can ever realize all those tasks that we are enforced to do. It is impossible. So basically we have impossible norms over lived experiences, embodied experiences of individuals, and we have to deal with it somehow. And most of us are kind of pretending that everything is fine, so basically the universality I'm claiming for is actually, and I'm asking for, is one that is held accountable for its premises. So we want everyone to be equal, fine, but then everyone. You know, a person of white color, of black color, of brown complexion, of whatever other color people might have, all these people should be equal in terms of gender as well, any gender. And then to make a universality active in this way, to make a claim to universality acting this way, but also to make claims for procedures and laws and other more detailed aspects of this universality, I believe that this is a quite radical, interestingly, this becomes a radical statement. So being, anti-norm, I think is quite systemic. And today everybody is against norms. So my demand, okay, let's make very clear norms of who is included and who is not. And let's make those norms for everyone. So this Hegelian kind of, Hegelian state preoccupied thinking becomes a radicalism today. Because if I'm claiming as a queer person, as a woman, if I'm producing claims towards the state, I'm actually doing a universalist practice. And if I'm also claiming it from the perspective of the weak person, so somebody who is, for instance, not articulate in the ways that an institution expects me to be, because I speak a different language from most men I know in academia, they speak a different academic English or Polish or French. That would be it for me. So this universality is a situation. We could speak of situated universality, if you like, a universality which comes from a certain, set of perspectives, and yet demands everything, demands all aspects, all humans or inhumans, if possible, to be included.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for this answer. I can see we have one answer here in the chat from Domi, who is our colleague in Gender Studies program. Domi, would you like to read this question yourself, or should I read it for you?
Oops. First I position my camera, but yes, I can read it myself because maybe it makes more sense, but I will read it because I'm afraid of getting lost otherwise. Hi, Eva, and thank you for everything so far. So I would like to hear more about this idea of the simple that you were talking about earlier in relation to the common, but specifically your choice of term simple when you were talking about the use of clothes or the hashtag for the different kind of mobilizations. And so then I added, although I completely see the power of these actions or symbols and of the very idea of what can be small or simple and the power it has, it seems to me that there can be a risk in this simplicity, in how, for example, it's linked to the so-called gut feeling in the right or fascists in Europe, at least in Italy and the Netherlands, as far as I know, that is exploited, right? This simple feelings or so. So in other words, how is this very idea of simplicity potentially dangerous when it's used by the right, so to speak, to criticize, for example, the anti-fascist feminists as too complicated?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. I'm struggling with it as well as with this notion of common as in common person or common woman. We had long debates in Poland about that, but that's a different controversy. I believe that what the right wing is talking about, and the notion they are actually using, correct me if I'm wrong, because maybe I get it wrong, but as far as I know, they often use the notion of natural. So not simple, but natural, which is very different. So they speak about disgust as natural. And this is a very tricky argument because disgust is a cultural phenomenon, obviously. So we know it from Bourdieu, we know it from feminist aesthetics theorists like Linda Neat, for instance, but also from Mary Douglas, fantastic analysis of disgust and how it is actually created, or Julia Kristeva. So depending, whether you are more into anthropology or into psychoanalysis or into other disciplines, you can find your theory of disgust, which is purely cultural phenomenon, and we are taught from childhood what should make us puke. Let's put it this way, and what should not. So therefore, the right wing is actually more often, I think, speaking of natural reaction and natural feeling. So they are disgusted by a feminist, or they are disgusted by, the dream. I will not go further into what disgusts the right wing because it's quite disgusting for me in a natural way. And so it is actually, in your question, it is the first time that I hear simple in this role of immediate accusation or immediate exclusion, and I can only respond to it by trying to, on one hand, make a distinction between what the right and the left understands as simple. So I would say that for the right wing, it is simple means something natural, and there we have them, because we can speak of nature as a construct till tomorrow or even longer, and therefore we got it. But then in this context of the left wing, I was simple is not usually the notion. It is not for me a notion here. It was one of the words that helped me to describe it. What I use as a more conceptually interesting notions is abstract, but also available. So these are so there we are kind of safe, because I'm following Boris Groys and his theory of weak universality as a core element of 20th century avant-gardes. So I'm speaking of simplicity, which has been acquired by a very careful choice of the symbolics, of the gestures, of the formats. So I'm looking at feminism in Poland, at this feminist mobilization from the aesthetic perspective, as in the specific division of the sensible. This is the notion of Jacques Rancière. So so this is my reference. It's Boris Groys with weak universalism, and it's Jacques Rancière with the new division of the sensible. So basically, we have seen how many we are on those pictures. So this was the simplicity somehow, that we were taking this shot, putting it online, and then we saw famous actresses and directors, Agnieszka Holland, fantastic people basically, Krystyna Janda, also an actress from the Oscar-winning, Venice Lions-winning film of Vaida. All kinds of very famous and very unfamous people. Also, people who had to prove to be quite heroic later, because they were accused and trialed in court for participating in this protest. They all won, luckily, but there were several cases when employers of different women were accusing them of sharing their political views. So the court had to tell them that in Constitution we actually are still granted to have political opinions and express them in Poland. also a very simple, very simple right. Yeah. So I don't know if I'm answering to it. I see the point that you are making, and obviously it is difficult to share something with the right wing for a left wing person. So there is this discomfort. But I believe that while on the left it's more about abstracting, it's more about choosing. Limiting the complexity in order for the biggest group of people to access and use a certain graphic or political element. On the right wing, it's more about natural and nature and what they perceive as nature. So I hope it answers in some way, at least to some extent. Thanks.
Super, thank you, Domi, and thank you, Ewa, for your answer. Are there any other questions anybody would like to ask? Just please go ahead and come forward. Nothing?
This might mean that the project is not so adequate for today.
I think it is very adequate, but sometimes it's very hard to wrap our heads around what is happening today. I think it's more about the complexity of the current situation, I would say. Domi, you want to say something more?
I mean, I have more questions, so as long as nobody else speaks.
There is Olivieri also.
Yeah,
that's Domi, exactly.
Maybe a question, I don't know if this can also make the debate go in more relatable ways to some of the students as well. But I was wondering, so as an Italian feminist myself, let's say, the connection between anti-fascism and feminism is a specific history, right, of resistance and all of that. So I'm mostly curious when you, especially with the projects that you've been doing and when you go around talking to different crowds in different countries, especially in Europe, I'm wondering, is there any resistance that you feel about feminists who might not feel so comfortable with the notion of anti-fascism, and how do you go about that?
So that's a fantastic question. I'm going to answer from the other way around. So I'm going to tell you about the resistance from anti-fascists to this idea that feminism is actually at the core of anti-fascism, because this was quite a big struggle. And I must say that, for instance, in 2019, when I was sort of beginning this, I mean, for me it was always obvious, but then I realized that it's not obvious among the scholars focusing on fascism and fascist history, etc. So I had a fantastic opportunity to talk with Roger Griffin, who is the editor-in-chief, used to be the editor-in-chief of the Fascist Studies Journal. So basically, you know, in academic terms, one of the most important, maybe the most important publication concerning fascism. And for him, this was a complete extravaganza. He was first of all, he was very resistant to the idea of speaking about fascism today, because this was another problem that most people, and by people I mean fantastic scholars and exemplary researchers on the question of fascism, were actually very hesitant towards the idea that we should use the notion of fascism to depict the phenomena, the political phenomena of today. So this resistance was in Berlin and post-Yugoslavian countries. Many scholars from those regions were speaking of historical fascism and post-fascism or quasi-fascism or post-fascism is also the notion. Let me hold on a second. I tend to forget his name, so I'm sorry. So Enzo Traverso, a fantastic scholar and researcher into the history of the left, but also fascism, he also prefers to speak about post-fascism. And in a long conversation that he has about today's fascism, he positively approaches the idea that today's fascism is much more focused on gender and intimacy, but it is being sort of enforced on him by the interviewer. So the woman who is interviewing him, she puts on the agenda the topic of feminism, etc., etc. On the other hand, from the feminist perspective, I mentioned Agnieszka Graf and Elżbieta Korolczuk, authors of this amazing book that I totally recommend, The Anti-Gender Movements in Times of Populism. Amazing study, in-depth study. Actually, Ela Korolczuk was going to Verona and other places where gatherings of the anti-genderists were happening. So I admire her for that. I would never have the patience to, you know, stay a couple of days on those gatherings where all this homophobic, anti-feminist statements are being made. So they really deeply studied it, and yet they were mentioning on many occasions their resilience, to put it the least, to say the least, on the idea of using fascism as an umbrella concept for the anti-gender movements and the historical fascism, etc. So there we have a constant debate. It's interesting how they evolve somehow. I mean, once again, I'm very unhappy of the accuracy of my sort of understanding of today's politics, because unfortunately it is more and more clear for the majority of those researchers I mentioned that we are dealing with fascism today. So this became, I think, and Roger Griffin, so in 2019, he was still refusing even the using of notion fascism towards politics of today. And in 2021, he already said that in his book, he has a whole chapter on how we witness a rebirth of fascism. And then with Agnieszka Graf and Elżbieta Korolczuk, so the Polish and Swedish partially feminist scholars, they would also have the resilience. But this resilience is also unfortunately, well, fortunately decreasing, unfortunately for the reality and fortunately for my theoretical perspective. So, yeah, so basically, I would say that women and queer persons on the side of feminist scholarship are definitely positive about recognizing the centrality of the issues of sexuality and orientation and reproductive rights at the core of today's struggles with the right wing. So this, with this, there is no problem. But the notion of fascism is one that most scholars on the feminist side, but also on the side of the political theory and political theory of fascism, they would avoid it, or at least build very precise conditions under which we can use them. And what I'm doing is, I mean, I'm more affiliated with philosophy and history of ideas and this kind of disciplines. So in my field, I'm actually more free to build more generalized notions and to actually try to examine how this generality or universality, if you want it, to what extent I can push this notion of fascism or of feminism as the core of anti-fascism. So for instance, from many people, I had this question concerning Black Lives Matter. And over there, the answer is twofold. On one hand, the majority of protests globally, in Poland, in the US, in Western countries, the majority of protests were actually packed with young women. This is maybe the first time in at least in Europe, but also in the US, when in anti-racist protests, you see more women than men. And this is what was the experience of the Black Lives Matter in many countries and in many cities. Also, the organizational structures of various branches of Black Lives Matter mobilizations, the organization was on the side of women. So this is again a shift, because if you look at classical Antifa, you don't see so many women. You actually see scarce amounts of women still in the 1980s, for instance, in the UK or in Germany, where anti-fascist movement was really, you know, strong, powerful, and big in numbers. Still, it would be to a large extent a man-dominated movement. So now we see a change in the structure of the movement, in the actual humans, embodied humans that participate. But also, I believe the politics, the postulates, the demands that are being produced cease to be heroic, brave, exceptional as they used to be, and they emphasize and again, I will not use the word simplicity because that's not precise enough, but I would say commonality, the ordinary postulates and demands instead of exceptional ones, the strategies that consist in resilience and in sustainability, maintenance of populations, rather than heroic bravery and conquest. So that's a huge difference, I think, and it requires a feminist. A feminist examination. So I think that the feminist scholarship should be focusing a little bit more on this transition, because it is an exceptional one. And we might be witnessing a general shift of political agency that goes unnoticed to large parts because it is not very common still to see feminism as a political option together with conservatism, liberalism, socialism, etc. We have to put feminism over there. We cannot still separate, you know, we cannot make of feminism a political option which is far, far away in another galaxy. It has to be in our galaxy. Okay, I see two hands, so basically I'll stop.
Perfect. I see one hand. I saw Lindsay. I don't know if there's another hand. But Lindsay, I saw that you put your hand up. Oh, and I also can see Nasreen now. Okay, I think who was first? Hard to say. I think Lindsay was first and then Nasreen.
Okay, we see Nasreen, I think. So go
perfect.
ahead.
So Nasreen, please. Nasreen, please go ahead with your question.
Yeah, I can go first. Hello, hello. Thank you so much for this brilliant talk. My question is about the notion of the feminist counterpublics and the importance of moving towards non-conventionally activist spaces, such as you said, states and medical institutions, and also private businesses. So I'm wondering. I'm wondering how can we mobilize, you know, this heterogeneity which you addressed and elaborated on, and also the impurity. You know, how can we mobilize an impurity in our movements, but at the same time resist the co-optation that can happen and the depoliticization of our struggle by neoliberal state institutions, NGOs, and as you said, you know, as you mentioned, private businesses. So I'm curious if you have some more thoughts on this.
Of course. So you know there is this magic power of magic power of disobedience, which is a fantastic power and yet a very difficult version of agency, and non-conformity, and also sort of resignation from comfort. So I believe that, you know, the moment when we settle for comfort is a moment when we resign from co-optation. And this is very unfortunate, because I believe that comfort should be universally available to all of us. Unfortunately, those who are parts in any way of anyhow discriminated or marginalized groups, first of all, should claim, I mean, the most audacious claim that I have ever heard was one about eternity. So somebody in Poland, I think, made this beautiful slogan, eternity should be a right and not a privilege. And that was also another beautiful way of trying to, you know, to access those cultural goods that have been usually seen as conservative only. And here we go with like a queer homeless person, probably, unfortunately, saying that eternity should also be a right for everyone, basically, in the universal way. So one of the tools to ensure the non-co-optation is obviously resistance and resignation from constant comfort, unfortunately. But then another one is a collective labor, a collective work towards universality, understood as heterogeneic, as ontologically diversified and also contradictory. So if we build universality in this way, it might be more difficult for hegemonic groups and persons to sort of take over. So I believe that, I very much believe that a certain amount of structure and legal provisions can also ensure a certain diversity and a certain respect for difference. But unfortunately, those mechanisms of co-optation are very simple, and we can see it in academia when we think of anti-discriminatory academic tools and institutions. There we see a full cooptation. And this is so unfortunate. I mean, this is the legacy of Sarah Ahmed and also of Catherine McKinnon, with whom I disagree on a variety of subjects, including pornography, sex work, etc., etc. But I do agree with her that the US-American system of academic anti-discriminatory tools is not effective. Also in Poland, we see the ineffectivity of it. So basically what we observe, and this is a beautiful, this is a very sad example, a very, very sad example of a cooptation which is complete. There is almost no cases of discrimination and harassment that have been solved in ways that made the complainants happy. The persons who are complaining usually are very unhappy in the course of the procedures and after. So this is an amazing example, a very scary example and a shameful example of how feminist postulates, feminist demands, feminist methodologies in many ways, because it took many feminists to build those networks of, you know, anti-discriminatory commissions, proceedings, laws, blah, blah, blah. There is a beautiful plethora of this, but unfortunately, in most cases, it simply does not work. And it serves to legitimize further perpetuation of inequalities, unfortunately. So that's a very huge paradox. And this is a sort of example of how it shouldn't function and how, I would say, how the heterogeneity has been abandoned and how sort of in further pushing of discrimination to individual cases has made it impossible to actually produce a general pattern to diminish discrimination. So, so that would be, yeah, so that would be a bad example. And then a good example, I would suggest, is the feminist movement in the US and in Poland and other places. So our movements are beautiful in this way, and we managed to, you know, to incorporate more and more territories that have been unknown. So right now we have business women who are going to marches. We have a contingent of corporate lawyers who are feminists, who are marching in women's marches with, you know, banners informing of the. This, I think, is a big appropriation from the side of the movement, not necessarily a co-optation, because right next there is, I don't know, a bunch of BDSM squatters community, lesbian, queer, etc., marching together. So they are somehow, how to say, on the level of visibility, it actually is difficult to say who co-opts whom to a bigger extent, right? There is a certain, I would say, equality in difference in the visual dimension of those two contingents. I just gave an example that is actually roughly true in the context of Warsaw protests. So what I'm trying to say is that the movements managed to spread in different areas. However, within certain institutional practices, we see a full-on co-optation, which is dramatic and very scary. So I'm not sure what is exactly the answer to the question, because it is a very difficult, very good, but very difficult question. But perhaps one idea is to remember that non-conformism is a part of any social movement's legacy. Okay, I think I tried. I gave it a shot, and thank you for the question again.
Thank you, Ewa. Lindsay, would you like to ask your question as the last closing question of the session?
Yes, please. Yeah. Oh dear. Well, yeah. Thank you so much. This was really invigorating and really re-energized me on this conversation that I feel like I've been having ever since I came into the academy without a lot of contents or productivity for me. And I think one thing that I want to ask tentatively, because I think it's a big question, is what, when you're talking also about this kind of conversation earlier about whether or not, or the scholars debating whether something is fascist or not. or like what, you know, which is the like relationship of history. I'm also wondering if there is an aspect of this that divides along less aesthetic registers and more like tactical registers in terms of like violence and like defensive violence, like defending the counterpublic, and yeah. So maybe if you could just speak to that, maybe differentiation of like a feminist anti-fascism, one that like both takes into account these registers of like the aesthetic and representation, but also maybe, yeah, like what is brought up when it actually comes down to doing the anti-fascism, and yeah.
This is a fantastic question, which actually made me realize that I'm mostly, when I'm defining fascism or anti-fascism later, I'm really focusing on one hand the aesthetic in the more sort of common sense, but also the aesthetics in sense of form. So I'm really thinking of legal and aesthetic measures first of all, and actually it is the legal that matter the most. So when I'm trying to reconstruct what fascism is, I'm thinking of a legal structure of a state. I'm thinking of making the sovereign, you know, beyond a law creator who is beyond the law. This is what Hitler wanted. This is what any totalitarian power wants. It's basically to be a creator of law who is exempt of the legal limitations, right? And also on the other hand, on the other side of the equation, we have the homo sacer, so the, you know, the excluded other who is, you know, sanctified in a symbolic way, but also who is reduced to their bare life. So this is what so this is what I usually say when I depict fascism. So therefore, for me, and this is an important part of the also of the book and of other lectures, but here somehow it didn't, it wasn't so evident. So for me, the fascist proceeding is actually to reduce somebody's life to the bare life. And this is, I think, what happens with women in Poland under the legislation, the anti-abortion legislation. I mentioned it very briefly with this example of Jarosław Kaczyński, the Polish vice prime minister, who said, I quote, "Women should give birth no matter what." So this is a moment when our life, because most of women are capable technically to become pregnant, right? So this is a sort of bad universality that Kaczyński created for people who would, you know, define themselves as women. Most of us, because for some of us it would not be possible to become pregnant, but for the majority of us it would be actually possible. So therefore, his claim that we should give birth no matter what, no matter whether we have a dead body inside of our body already, because this was the actual context. So basically, I think that the feminist anti-fascism is obviously an agency to stop this kind of limiting of women, but also of refugees, of queer persons, etc., of limiting all those identities, all those persons to bare life without any symbolic significance. So that would be, and therefore, the majority of feminist movement is not so much about, you know, weaving a black cloth or something. It's very much about resisting a certain legislation, resisting certain forms of violence, about producing also a community. So this feminist I like the notion of counterpublics because it is not only a negative notion. Counterpublics is something. It's not a negation of something. It's something. While anti-fascism is to a large extent a negation of fascism in all various levels. So I'm using the concept, the notion of counterpublics to say that there is positively some public sphere, alternative public sphere being created. But by public sphere, I understand a bit more than Jürgen Habermas and other theorists. So I don't only understand it as a space of debate, I understand it also as a community, a very diversified, contradictory community in which me and some conservative businesswoman and some Ukrainian refugee and somebody else again find our place, sometimes acting together, sometimes contradicting each other and marching in, contradictory demonstrations or something. But so I'm not sure if I'm exactly answering your question, but I would say that this process of creating the counterpublics is an active process of building a community, of building another way of being together, basically, another way of creating a political entity that has very different norms. So in Poland, we have this sense of split lives. We have the official political life, which uses the hate speech. Seriously, our president, Andrzej Duda, has said in 2017 that the LGBT people are not actually people. They pretend to be people, but they in fact are ideology. End of quote. This is the discourse that we have that we are listening to since six years now. So there is this, and then on the other hand, you have this feminist counterpublics, as I would call it, very active now. By the way, many groups, internet groups, online groups of feminist movement became solidarity with Ukraine groups, very many of them. So as you see, it is very easy, also in times when LGBTQ persons were attacked, many of those groups were immediately becoming, LGBTQ groups or LGBTQ allies or solidarity groups, depending on their composition, obviously. So what I'm trying to say is that this counterpublics is an entity, not only a negation. It is an entity, a political entity of embodied humans that try to connect to each other with in specific way. For instance, respecting the diversity very often. Also, it depends which part of the counterpublics we are talking about, right? But there are very many that try new versions of being together. For instance, local groups. When I was living in Berlin, I was in a gal-to-gal group in April 2016 with women ranging from squatters to high-profile business women and very rich artists across the society, basically. We had all kinds of political opinions, very diversified, from anarchism to kind of conservative liberalism via all versions of, socialism and liberalism. So we were pretty diverse, and yet, in this moment when, the lives of women were endangered by the anti-abortion legislation, all of a sudden we managed to build something together, but also to use different capacities and abilities that we've had. So this is the transversality that I'm talking about. It's that all those members of this small group became super influential in their circles, and therefore we would have hundreds of women in front of the Polish consulate, precisely because we have reached all kinds of, members of the Berlin Polish diaspora. So therefore, it could be visibly effective, but also we were learning what it means to be together. So what kind of competences we can share, who can teach the others about what, and vice versa, so how we can exchange our experiences and knowledges, etc. So it was, I must say, one of the first groups in which I was member with people whose political ideas are very abstract for me, to say the least, and yet in this specific aspect, so it was a kind of, network or coalition, strategic network or strategic coalition. But then we discovered that we actually are building something together. So apart from the general Polish diaspora in Berlin, there was this feminist diaspora in Berlin, which I think still somehow functions. So some connections that have been built there have been, resisted time and history and became quite stable. So I think generally the notion of counterpublics is an interesting one if we want to replace resistance by something more substantial, by a notion that speaks about a new composition. I believe that it is maybe a better one and more interesting one. However, most people read it still as a kind of equivalent to political debate, and therefore things have to be explained. Sorry for taking that much time, and thank you for the question again.
Thank you so much, Ewa, and thank you for taking time to answer the questions. Talking about time, we are out of it though. So I would like to thank you, Ewa, so much for your thoughts, for sharing your work with us. I would also like to thank everyone who asked questions and everyone who attended the meeting today, or the discussion Doing Gender lecture today. And yes, see you at the next Doing Gender lecture.
Thank you so very much for the invitation and the attention and questions, and Magda for the invite and for the sharing, and to everyone who made it possible also with the recording, and to all those who listened and and who were there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.